Remasters and remakes have become a fairly common occurrence within the gaming industry, from graphical updates to controller reholds to, well, frankly, the entire game being retold ever so slightly differently and really drawing into question what actually counts as a remaster and a remake. But at the end of the day, these games are coming out and they're selling pretty darn well. And it definitely draws up the question, is this a good thing? Whenever we think back at our time in games, we're always going to draw in on the most influential, drawing upon the memories of games that stood out. And inevitably, when we see that those games are coming back, we're going to want to try them out. We're going to want to see what it looks like in full HD graphics or 4K at 60 frames per second. In fact, if you go back long enough, you may not even need the 4K in that statement. But the point is, they definitely draw upon nostalgia. The promise of the glories of the past while bringing in the technology, the abilities of the present, surely to allow us to create new memories, better memories with these games now they've been realized and actualized up to a much higher modern standard. Well, for the rest of this conversation, I'm going to completely jump over all of the games that completely failed in that regard and ended up an absolute buggy mess and are vastly inferior to their originals. Yes, that's a pretty big jump, but just run with me on this. Let's assume that all the remasters come out and work perfectly. Something that actually, now I say that in the modern day, would be basically a miracle. But if we assume they do, then we have to start looking at whether or not these games are simply things we want or things we actually need. Well, there is definitely an argument surrounding the idea of bringing back older games, not only just in the form of preserving the history of the game and ensuring that new gamers can try it out, but also it's a guaranteed sale. It's going to ensure that the veteran players, people who remember these games and loved them, will go out of their way to try the new ones. They want to see the new version, the updated graphics with modern sensibilities and a sheer lack of tank controls. And I've definitely seen games come out that have done exceedingly well based upon that. A great example is the Tony Hawk's Remaster. Not only did it capture the hearts of new gamers, but it also rekindled a passion for the game within the veteran community. And, quite frankly, brought back to life a dying franchise. And this is the main defense I hear. We often say it's good for companies to return to their roots, to look back on what they've done before, to look back on what was successful and work more towards that. However, I would argue this is not returning to the roots. This isn't even attempting to reclaim them. This is literally stepping backwards. As an archaeologist, whenever looking back at any kind of archaeological evidence or historical, if I'm absolutely forced to read a book rather than consider what it's made of, then you always have to take into account the context of its creation. The people and the events that led up to the creation of those old games, the very world in which they were built, is completely different. And that's just from the development perspective. The modern demographic of gamers is completely different to what it was 10-20 years ago. Not to mention the fact that gaming has become vastly more mainstream, with far more accessibility to games on an international level, meaning that those meaningful games of the past may no longer have any relevance to today. They may not have the impact they once had, or the systems and mechanics that once were so good now just seem to pale in comparison, having been refined or even surpassed in the years since. So looking back at the vast library of gaming history, how can you even decide which ones should be remade? And since they may not have the same impact, since they may not have that relevance anymore, how can you possibly decide what is and is not worthy of that retelling? But in reality, for me at least, it really comes down to the question of why are we retelling them in the first place? The story has been told, a great story indeed, and yes, worthy of remembrance. But then shouldn't the game simply be brought up to date to work on modern hardware, rather than remastering or remaking, simply republishing, ensuring that the games aren't lost and forgotten to the annals of time? After all, there's still a massive retro gaming market out there. People will seek out older consoles to play these older games. It seems foolish almost to simply not update them to work on modern systems. But even if we tried that, we then hit another problem. Can old games even be remastered? Can you take an old FMV game and get it to run on next-gen consoles? So why then this barely coherent discussion on games and remastering? Well, it all comes down to a question I've received. A question by Ghost Rider surrounding the potential remaster of Medieval and Shogun Total War. Total War series having already completed remasters for Rome, updating it and bringing it out onto handheld devices for some reason. before finally seeing sense and remastering it on computer, only to then, even more recently, bring out Medieval 2 once more onto those handheld devices, with suggestions that yes, eventually this will find its way onto PCs. Two classic games from the early 2000s that not only stand as iconic games within the franchise, but also redefine the grand strategy genre. And more questions as always, why then have the originals not been redone? Why have Shogun and Medieval been completely left out when Rome and Medieval 2, yes, bringing things up to date for 3D graphics, completely upholding the grand strategy community instantly on their release, have gotten their remaster, yet the ones that paved the way, the ones that set the very foundations from which those games were created, have seemingly been left in the dark? Well, let's start answering some of those questions. For starters, Rome and Medieval 2 are both based upon 3D graphics, something that has become fairly integral within modern gaming, at least at the AAA standard. They look good, they're large in scope, held up within the community as the golden age of the franchise, with even amongst veterans, many seeing the older Shogun and Medieval as simply too clunky, too hard to control to really be worth their time in going back to. Not to mention lacking a lot of the modern mechanics that we've grown to enjoy, with individual provinces set within regions, an entire rehaul to how movement works and how that campaign map links into battles, providing you specific terrain and mapping for those battles in direct relation to where you place your units and where you meet your enemy upon the campaign map. Suffice to say, they are significantly closer to what the modern Total War community has grown accustomed to, setting them out as a great game for that remaster potential, drawing in the veterans for the golden age of Total War, while still providing something close enough that new modern players are going to be able to understand and get into without any troubles. Whereas, if we take a look over at Medieval and Shogun, these games run extremely different to the modern sensibility. Not only have the vast majority of those 3D models completely been removed, but we also have to consider that, being replaced by the gorgeous pixel perfection of sprites, we have to consider the battles, we have to consider the economic and political systems and how they work within these older games. And the biggest standout for me is going to be that map. Moving from a top-down 3D representation of the world to a static 2D drawn map is quite a jump. Not to mention adding in that having individual cities, individual provinces, fortifications and bridges that you can actively move towards and abuse and use on the campaign being entirely replaced by the solid borders of an extremely large area of which, should you move your armies from any adjoining region upon that border, are simply considered within it and bound by the maps dedicated to that area. The method of fielding your armies, moving around this Risk-esque board, being picked up and placed down with little consideration towards tactical advantage in regards to the environment, for me is absolutely fine. That's what I was brought up with, that's what I'm used to, but for many a gamer who's been introduced to the series post-Rome, this is going to be a huge shift of gears. And honestly, in as far as the Total War franchise goes, I almost see this as a step back. The series had already long moved on from this simplified setup and started to look into more advanced ways of using the map, at least until it completely broke it. It had already taken that leap, moved into 3D, tried something new and begun experimenting with its new design, introducing more advanced sieges, tactical formations for your units, and greatly refined its UI to make all of this more accessible to players and easier to control on the battlefield. All things that would need to be introduced to the original Shogun and Medieval to bring the game up to par, and that's without even getting into those political and economic systems. Essentially what you'd end up doing is rebuilding the original Shogun and Medieval into a modern game. You'd be losing the charm of what was in order to introduce it to new players. Now the simplified design of that campaign play could still hold up, and I stand by that statement, especially considering that Feral Interactive has consistently brought out their remasters, which yes I know there only have been 2, but that still shows consistency, onto mobile first. And I truly believe that a remaster of the original Medieval and Shogun could do extremely well on a handheld device. The simplified controls lend themselves perfectly to this, and the slower pace of battles would allow for the awkwardness in trying to control any units on a touchscreen. But could that be brought over onto computer? Honestly, I don't even see the point. The only thing these games require is a patch that, technically speaking, already exists. The ability to change resolutions and try and get the game looking as good as possible, which, to be fair, the sprites look pretty darn good to begin with. But this has already happened. You can boost the resolution pretty much as high as you want, apart from the menu screens, which is really weird. And there are options available for customizing your controls and trying to get them to a point that you're comfortable with. Or if you're after that true nostalgia hit, you simply play the game as it came out. The point being, and in answering that question of should all games be remastered, in this case, I honestly think no. And I don't say that because I wouldn't enjoy it if it happened, but because the update wouldn't really add much. And if it did, if it changed those things, if it rebuilt the game into a modern sensibility, well, then you basically have Shogun and Medieval 3. Two games that I would much rather see created than a remaster of the old. Which draws us back to that point of context. The original history of these games is still preserved. We still have them. We can still play them. And the fact that these games are available right now and capable of working on modern machines is testament to that. The preservation of gaming in history is a thing that is happening, and beyond ensuring that they still play on modern systems, I truly don't believe much more needs to be done, and that all this looking back, remastering, rebuilding, and attempting to recapture that nostalgia is doing nothing to help the state of gaming. We're no longer experimenting and trying new ideas. That's gone out the window. It's not profitable. We're looking back and seeing what can be repackaged in order to ensure an earning. And we can already see this has happened in terms of Rome. Rome Remaster came out and it was thoroughly enjoyable. But at the end of the day, unless you're dedicating yourself to Rome and Rome alone, there's not much reasoning to stay with it. And though some liberties were taken in adding new features, those features were still bound by the old mechanics. They were still bound by the old system, rather than starting from a fresh platform and trying something completely new. The introduction of Warhammer to the Total War franchise was a massive shift in how the game worked, and love it or hate it, the introduction of fantasy completely opened the doors on what could be done with a Total War game. The risk and the experimentation paid off. It introduced new gamers to the franchise and saw veterans trying something completely new and thoroughly enjoying it. Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 were absolutely fantastic games, and no doubt we'll see something new when the true Warhammer 3 is released. And this brings in another point. Even when new games come out and they may not do so well, to put it lightly, the Rift campaign, love it or hate it, is a great example of what gaming needs. And yes, if you've played it, I know how terrible that sounds. But the thing is, so many games from so many companies are starting to lose their experimentation. They're starting to lose their want and drive of seeing what else they can do and how else they can make a game that people will love. Instead, they're looking at the past. They're taking what has already worked and they're sticking with it. And yes, that will sell games, that will keep the industry going, but it won't see it progress. It won't see it develop, it won't see it expand, it won't see it reach new horizons. It's taking something that is literally limitless, the ability to create an entire world to your design, to engage in any fantasy you wish or enact any part of history you so desire, and instantly limiting it. So at the end of this barely coherent ramble, just what do I think about the potential for a new Shogun and Medieval? I'd love to see a port, bringing them over onto a handheld device, conquering Omega as I wait to get on the train there, but would I like to see a remaster? No. I want to see Shogun 3. I want to see Medieval 3. I want to see what's next. I want to see what new ideas come out when people put their heads together, sit down, and work it through. When will we have our pike and shot Total War? When will the Mongols have their saga? When will Korea be introduced into the Three Kingdoms? And that's without even looking towards mods for inspiration. World War I mods have done extremely well within the franchise, and it literally boggles my mind why we haven't seen any hints towards that. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, but I have no idea why CA hasn't gone out of their way and paid any price required in order to gain the rights to make Lord of the Rings. It is literally printing money. But that's a discussion for another day, and a day I really hope will eventually come where we start to see more experimentation, more diversity within games, trying new things, engaging with new ideas, and yes, we're gonna see failures, we're gonna see more Rift campaigns, but whatever happens, it's better than turning into Call of Duty. But this is just one bear's ramble. What do you guys think? Until next time, as always, peace out.